The morning began the way all soft mysteries do, with a sound too small to notice and a feeling that something gentle had shifted in the air. Morty blinked awake to the dim blue light filtering through the blinds, the hum of Rick's distant machinery vibrating faintly through the walls. The air smelled faintly like burnt toast and ozone. It was, by all appearances, just another ordinary day. But then he blinked again, and it happened twice. He wasn't sure what changed. Maybe the way the curtains swayed a second slower, or how the light hit the cereal box from a different angle. But something deep in his chest whispered that the morning had already happened once before. The spoon in his hand trembled slightly as if remembering its last movement. The milk poured the same, but the splash sounded softer this time, like it was trying to keep a secret. Rick shuffled into the kitchen, muttering something about dimensional stabilizers and bad coffee filters. His lab coat looked a little shorter, or maybe Rick had gotten taller. Morty couldn't tell. When Rick set his mug down, Morty noticed the sound again, a soft clink that seemed to echo twice, overlapping for just a breath before dissolving. "You good, Morty?" Rick grunted without looking up. Morty nodded slowly, even though he wasn't. "Yeah, just déjà vu or something?" Rick smirked faintly, steam from his cup curling upward in delicate spirals. "Déjà vu's just your brain buffering, Morty. The simulation stutters sometimes. Go back to eating your cereal." But Morty's spoon hovered mid-air. The cereal looked wrong, like it had been rearranged by invisible hands. A loop, a pattern repeating. He looked toward the window and noticed a leaf falling, tracing the same curve twice before vanishing into the same patch of sunlight. He didn't know how to explain it, but it felt like waking up inside a reflection. When he blinked again, Rick wasn't there. Then, a second later, he was back in the same spot, stirring his coffee again, humming a tune Morty didn't recognize. Morty's pulse softened, more curious than afraid. "Did you?" Morty began. Rick interrupted, not even glancing up. "Yeah, I felt it too." They stood there for a moment listening. The refrigerator hummed like a sleeping creature. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked twice for every second. Morty exhaled, long and quiet. "So, what is it?" Rick finally looked at him. His eyes weren't sharp the way they usually were. They looked almost tired. Could be a glitch. Could be the end of the world. Or could be breakfast. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Let's see which one finishes first." The day unfolded like a song that kept replaying its first verse. Morty walked to school and passed the same cracked sidewalk twice. A dog barked in the same rhythm. The sky itself seemed to blink. He began to notice small differences too, details that shouldn't have changed but did. The graffiti on the corner wall had one extra letter. A cloud moved backward. His own reflection in a passing window looked half a second behind. At first, it scared him. But then, it didn't. The repetition felt strangely comforting, like the universe was gently trying again, wanting to get something right, each loop softer than the last. Each difference small and tender, as if time itself was breathing. When he got home that evening, Rick was still in the kitchen, surrounded by tools and coils of wire. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and static. Rick didn't say hello. He just pointed at a strange little device humming quietly on the counter. "Temporal echo stabilizer," Rick said. "Probably. Or maybe it's a radio for ghosts," Morty frowned. "So there are other USCs?" Rick shrugged. "Might be. You think you're special enough to only exist once? The multiverse is like a hall of mirrors, Morty. Some cleaner, some cracked, but all of them looking back." Morty stared at the window again, the evening sky turning deep indigo. His reflection blinked at the same time he did. But this time he noticed a faint delay, a hesitation, as though the boy in the glass was thinking his own thoughts. Rick's voice softened, barely above the hum of the stabilizer. The trick isn't figuring out which one's real, it's figuring out which one knows how to rest. The words lingered like dust in the air. Morty didn't fully understand them, but they settled deep in his chest, like a note that kept vibrating long after the sound faded. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he heard the faintest whisper of movement beyond his door. A floorboard creaked, not quite in sync with his own heartbeat. He turned his head slowly toward the dim glow of the hallway. For a moment, he thought he saw himself, another Morty, standing there in the half-light, eyes closed, breathing softly, as if dreaming while awake. Neither of them moved. The air between them shimmered faintly, like two raindrops about to merge. Then the other Morty smiled, almost sadly, and faded into the shadows. Morty didn't scream or even sit up. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his blanket, the slow rhythm of his breath, the quiet pulse of something vast and tender brushing against his world. He whispered to the dark, "If there's more of me out there, I hope they're okay." Somewhere, he thought he heard an echo, soft, like a sigh. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and electricity. The same leaf from earlier drifted past the window again. Only this time, it didn't fall. It hung there for a while, suspended in moonlight, as if even gravity had chosen to rest. And for a brief, impossible moment, Morty felt like the world had stopped just for him. Not in warning or confusion, but in gentle understanding. He closed his eyes. The hum of the house deepened into stillness. The ticking clock merged into one steady heartbeat. Somewhere in the background, Rick muttered something about loops and calibration, but even that sounded far away, softened by sleep. The day, for the second time, came quietly to an end, and when Morty finally drifted off, he wasn't sure which version of him was dreaming, or if maybe, just maybe, all of them were. Morning came again, softly, hesitantly, as if unsure it was allowed to. The sunlight through the kitchen window looked almost identical to yesterday's, except maybe a little dimmer, a little slower. Morty sat at the table, watching the steam rise from his cereal milk in faint spirals that twisted and untwisted, like something alive trying to remember its shape. Rick was already there, half buried in a newspaper that he hadn't read in years and probably never would. He lifted his coffee mug, sniffed it, frowned, and took a sip anyway. "You ever notice," Morty said quietly, "that sometimes the world feels like it's running a rehearsal?" Rick didn't look up. "That's because it is. You think existence nailed it on the first try?" Morty tilted his head. "So, we're the practice round?" Rick smirked. "Nah, we're the dress rehearsal that forgot where the audience went." They sat there for a moment, surrounded by the gentle clinking of spoons and the whisper of the refrigerator. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand anything, the kind that allowed thoughts to settle like dust in a sunbeam. Morty noticed the reflections again, faint ghosts in every surface. His spoon reflected a slightly older version of himself, one who looked more tired, but more at peace. The glass of milk had two suns floating in it, both melting slowly into white. Even the table seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. He looked up at Rick. The old man's eyes were half-lidded, staring at nothing. The steam from his mug made the air shimmer around his face like a fading hologram. "Rick," Morty said softly, What if we're the copies?" Rick's expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened, his shoulders sinking just enough to betray the thought that he'd been asking himself the same question for a long time. "Then I guess that makes us lucky," Rick muttered. "Copies get to start fresh. Originals got to live with the mess they made." Morty looked down. His cereal had gone soggy, but he didn't mind. He swirled it gently, watching tiny reflections of the ceiling light ripple and fade. Outside, a wind moved through the trees, slow and rhythmic, like breathing. A paper from the counter fluttered onto the floor. When Morty bent to pick it up, he noticed another hymn standing at the hallway's edge. Faint, transparent, blinking out as soon as he focused on it. He froze. "Rick?" Rick didn't even turn around.
Yeah, I see him too. Probably last night's version.
"Don't spook him, he's delicate." The other Morty looked calm, almost serene. His outline shimmered softly, like light reflected off rippling water. He glanced toward Rick, then back at Morty, smiled faintly, and mouthed something Morty couldn't hear. Then he was gone, like mist dissolving into air. Morty swallowed hard. "So we're all just running at once?" Rick leaned back, balancing his chair on two legs. "Something like that. Think of it as a cosmic remix, Morty. Every time reality resets, it keeps the good notes and edits out the noise." Morty frowned.
How do we know which version we are?
Rick shrugged. "You don't. You just keep being you."
That's the only way to find out if it matters. For a while they didn't speak.
The sound of the ticking clock filled the space. But it was out of rhythm, skipping every few beats as if unsure of the tempo. Morty watched the coffee steam drift across the table, tracing invisible paths through sunlight. Each wisp seemed slightly different, some thin and sharp, others wide and soft. He realized that even the steam couldn't decide which direction it wanted to exist in. Rick reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded napkin. On it, written in tiny ink marks, were several looping equations and what looked like names: Morty, Rick, Summer, Beth, each repeated with different symbols beside them. Some were circled, others crossed out. "What's that?" Morty asked. Rick smiled wryly. "Breakfast notes." "Notes?"
Yeah, every time we run into another version of us, I write something down. Helps me keep track of what makes us. Us. Morty peered at the paper.
One line read, "Version 2, laugh softer." Another said version 4, forgave first. Morty traced the ink with his finger. "They're not experiments to you, are they?" Rick sighed. "Not today, Morty." They finished their breakfast slowly. The light shifted, pale gold turning to a mellow grey. The hum of the house deepened into something almost musical, like a lullaby played from somewhere inside the walls. When Morty stood to rinse his bowl, he noticed the reflection in the sink water again. The other Morty was there, faint and calm, mirroring his every move with perfect precision. But this time, the reflection didn't blink when he did. It simply smiled, a quiet, knowing curve of the lips, and then faded into the swirling drain. Rick stood behind him, silent, as if giving the moment space to breathe. "You ever wonder," Morty whispered, "if maybe they're the ones dreaming about us?" Rick chuckled softly. "Dreams are just reruns, Morty. The universe rewatching itself until it feels better about the ending." Morty smiled faintly. He didn't entirely understand, but the thought comforted him. As the morning light softened toward noon, the world around them seemed to stretch. Longer shadows, slower movements, everything wrapped in a strange, drowsy peace. Rick adjusted something on the counter, a small metal device emitting a low hum, like a cat purring in its sleep. "What's that one do?" Morty asked. Rick looked at it, then back at him. "It keeps the doubles from colliding." Morty tilted his head.
Colliding?
Rick smiled, eyes weary but warm. "Yeah, can't have too many of us learning the same lesson at once. The universe gets confused." Morty laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You make it sound like it's all some big nap we keep waking up from." Rick sipped the last of his coffee. "Maybe it is, Morty. Maybe the whole point isn't waking up. It's learning to rest without needing to." The words hung in the air, slow and heavy like falling feathers. Morty didn't reply. He just sat there, letting the sound of the world settle back into him. The quiet ticking, the faraway wind, the faint hum of something vast and gentle beneath it all, And somewhere between that sound and silence, he thought he could hear them, all the other versions, living their quiet mornings, sipping their coffee, finding peace in their own small loops. It didn't matter who was real anymore. What mattered was that they all were, in their own sleepy, forgiving way. The clock chimed once, and the day began again, softer, kinder, as if learning from itself. Evening fell like a sigh. The house had grown quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that seemed to hum with hidden things. Morty sat on the porch steps, watching the dusk bleed into blue. The wind moved lazily through the grass, and the stars began to appear one by one, slow, deliberate, like old friends returning to a place that remembered them. Rick stood a few feet away,
Hands buried in his coat pockets, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of the sky.
He didn't seem to be watching anything in particular, just listening, like he was trying to catch a tune the world had forgotten how to play. "Rick," Morty said softly, "where do the other versions go? The ones that disappear?" Rick didn't look at him. "Some get recycled."
Some drift, some find peace. Peace?
Morty echoed. Rick gestured toward the horizon.
Out there! Morty followed his gaze.
At first, it looked like a normal stretch of land, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw faint lights moving, soft glows weaving between dark silhouettes. They pulsed like heartbeat rhythms, scattered across a meadow that shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight. "What is that?" Morty whispered. Rick smiled faintly. "The Garden of Forgotten Versions." Morty frowned. "You mean like..."
A graveyard?
Rick shook his head. "Nah, nothing dies there, Morty. It's where the echoes go when they've learned what they were meant to." Morty stood, heart beating a little faster. The night was cool, filled with the smell of damp earth and old rain. The air felt thick, almost charged. He followed Rick down the small slope behind the house, where the grass grew wild and the stars seemed closer. As they walked, the sounds changed. The crickets' chirps began to blend with something else, faint, melodic tones, like distant chimes carried on the wind. The light grew stronger, forming shapes that shimmered between reality and memory. When they reached the edge of the meadow, Morty stopped. Dozen, maybe hundreds of figures moved within the garden. They were translucent, barely more than outlines of light, but each carried something distinct, a gesture, a tilt of the head, a familiar way of standing. Morty recognized them immediately. They were all him. Different Mortys. Older, younger, quieter, braver. Some laughed softly to themselves. Others knelt beside glowing pools of light, placing small objects into them. Memories, maybe. One of them turned, meeting Morty's eyes, and smiled. The same smile Morty had seen in the reflection that morning. Rick's voice was low. "Every time a version fades, it leaves behind its peace. The stuff that made it worth being." Morty couldn't move.
"They're
"Beautiful," he murmured. Rick nodded. "They're what happens when you stop running from yourself." Morty stepped forward. The air rippled around him, warm and humming. One of the other Mortys reached out a hand, hesitant, gentle, and for a moment their fingers touched. A pulse of light spread through the garden, and Morty felt something deep inside him soften. Memories flickered in his mind like candle flames. Laughter, loss, small moments of kindness he didn't remember living but somehow recognized. He whispered, "Are they..."
happy?" Rick smiled, at not the usual crooked grin, but something real and tired and full. "Happiness isn't the word, Morty. They're..."
Complete. Morty looked around. Some versions of him were sitting in circles, eyes closed, sharing silent thoughts. Others planted seeds made of light, which grew instantly into glowing vines that curled toward the stars. A few simply lay in the grass, hands folded behind their heads, watching the sky with quiet contentment. Everywhere he looked, there was peace, not the absence of chaos, but the acceptance of it. Rick knelt beside one of the glowing pools and dipped his finger into it. Ripples spread, showing faint reflections, different Ricks scattered across time. Each one looked a little different, one younger and clean-shaven, one older with softer eyes, one holding a bottle, one holding a book. Morty crouched beside him.
Are they yours?
Rick chuckled. Yeah, my garden's smaller, but it's growing. Morty studied him, the way his face softened in the light, the way his usual sharpness melted into something gentler. For the first time, Rick looked almost peaceful. You ever think about joining them? Morty asked. Rick didn't answer right away. He just watched the ripples fade back into stillness. Not yet, he said finally. Still got a few things to break before I can rest? Morty smiled sadly. You mean fix? Rick met his eyes.
No, Morty, I mean break.
Sometimes breaking's the only way to see what's worth keeping. They sat together in silence, the night breathing around them. The stars above pulsed faintly, in rhythm with the glowing garden below, as if the sky and earth were quietly syncing their heartbeats. Morty lay back on the grass, staring up. He felt the hum of the garden through the soil, a vibration that wasn't sound but something deeper, like the universe whispering under his ribs. Rick lit a cigarette, but didn't smoke it. He just watched the ember glow in his fingers, then let it burn out. After a while, Morty said, Do you think they remember us? The ones that moved on? Rick tilted his head.
Probably not.
But that's not a bad thing. Forgetting's just another way of forgiving. Morty closed his eyes. The garden's light washed over his skin, warm and soft. He felt like he was dissolving into it, just a little, like some part of him was being remembered somewhere else. In the distance, a breeze swept through the meadow, setting the glowing vines swaying like waves of starlight. The forgotten versions seemed to move with it, graceful and unhurried, blending into the rhythm of the night. Morty whispered, It's like they're dreaming the universe back to sleep. Rick smiled faintly. Maybe they are. Maybe that's what it means to be finished. The moon rose higher, spilling pale silver across the grass. The light touched Morty's face, and for a moment, his reflection shimmered beside him again. Calm, still, complete. Rick stood, brushed off his coat, and looked back toward the house.
Come on, Morty, the night's got work to do. Morty didn't move right away.
He took one last look at the garden, at all the forgotten selves glowing quietly beneath the stars, and felt something shift inside him. Not sadness, not loss, just a soft understanding. When he finally stood, the world felt lighter, like it had exhaled. As they walked back up the hill, the glow behind them dimmed, blending slowly into the dark. Only the faint hum remained, a lullaby beneath the soil, a promise that nothing truly ended. It only changed shape, and somewhere beyond the veil of dreams, another version of them was already arriving, eyes open, heart steady, ready to remember what they'd forgotten. Morning came with a weightless kind of quiet. The sun rose, slow and gold, gliding through the blinds in thin, trembling lines. Dust floated lazily in the light, catching on the edges of the air like suspended time. The house seemed calmer now, as if even the walls were breathing softer. Morty woke to the faint smell of coffee and paper. It wasn't unusual to hear Rick tinkering early, but there was something different about the rhythm today. Gentler, almost careful. When he shuffled into the garage, still half dreaming, he saw Rick sitting at his workbench, surrounded by small, red cutouts. They were hearts.
Hundreds of them.
Each one slightly imperfect, creased or uneven, cut by hand. Some were pinned to the wall. Others lay in a soft heap beside a glowing mug that read, "Don't panic, just clone smarter." Morty blinked.
Rick, you, having a Valentine's Day crisis or something? Rick didn't look up.
His voice was calm, too calm.
These aren't for love, Morty. They're for remembering. Remembering what?
Rick turned one of the paper hearts in his fingers. The light from his workbench flickered through it, painting his hand red. Who I've forgiven, Morty frowned.
You mean like other people?
Rick gave a small laugh that sounded like it hurt.
No, Morty, not other people. Versions. Morty stepped closer, his curiosity prickling.
On the table, he saw faint handwriting scrawled on some of the hearts. Not full names, just fragments. R3, M27, R', Summer, Vi. The paper trembled faintly under the low hum of the machines. Rick continued, his voice low and almost tender. I used to mark them to keep track. You know, which ones were safe, which ones might turn homicidal, standard protocol. But then I started seeing them differently. Every time I found a clone that looked at me with fear instead of hate, I thought, maybe they didn't need deleting. Maybe they just needed to be forgiven. Morty picked one up. Soft, thin, still warm from the lamp's heat.
So that you're giving them hearts now?
Rick leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. You ever notice, Morty, how the only way you can tell something's real is by how it breaks? Morty hesitated.
Not really.
Rick exhaled, the sound half sigh, half chuckle. Paper's weak, fragile, tears easy.
That's what makes it honest.
These hearts remind me that even the copies deserve a chance to fall apart on their own terms. Morty stood in silence, trying to process the strange softness in Rick's voice. He wasn't used to hearing him talk like that. Slow, deliberate, almost poetic. Rick reached for a new sheet of paper and began folding it with steady hands. The scissors clicked quietly, slicing through the moment. Each snip sounded like the tick of a patient clock. After a while, Morty asked, "So what happens when you run out of paper?" Rick grinned faintly.
Then I'll start using napkins.
Or receipts. The universe won't run out of second chances, Morty. It's just a matter of how willing we are to hand them out. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the windows. The morning light deepened into a warm amber glow, washing over the garage. The air smelled faintly of ozone, coffee, and something nostalgic. Old printer ink, maybe. Morty sat on the edge of the workbench, watching. You think this'll fix things? Rick paused, scissors mid-air. Fix? No, that's not what this is for. He placed the finished heart gently on the pile. It's for remembering not to destroy everything I can't control. The hum of the machines faded into a quieter tone, like they, too, were listening. Morty picked up a few of the hearts and began helping. Cutting, folding, scribbling small words he didn't entirely understand. Kindness, patience, forgive. It felt almost meditative, like building something invisible between them. After a long silence, Rick spoke again. You know what the problem with cloning is, Morty? Morty shook his head. It teaches you that being replaceable is the same as being worthless. But it's not. It just means every version of you gets another shot at being better. Morty stared at him, eyes soft.
That's kinda...
Beautiful, Rick. Rick snorted lightly. Don't make it weird.
I'm still me, Morty. I don't know.
I'm trying to stop hating the versions that failed. For a while, the only sounds were scissors, paper, and breath. When they were done, Rick handed Morty a small bundle, a handful of paper hearts tied together with string.
Take these, he said.
If you meet another Morty, one that's scared or lost or thinks he's the wrong one, give him one of these. Tell him it's a reminder that he doesn't have to prove he's real. Morty nodded slowly, feeling something stir in his chest. A small ache that was both sad and warm. Rick turned away, pretending to adjust a monitor. Don't look at me like that, Morty. I'm not turning sentimental. It's just physics. Energy moves better when it's forgiven. Morty laughed softly. Yeah, okay, Rick. They stood in the garage doorway for a while, watching the sunlight settle on the grass. The wind picked up, fluttering one of the paper hearts off the table. It drifted lazily through the air, landing near the threshold. Morty bent down and picked it up. The word mine was written in the corner. He looked at Rick. Rick shrugged. Guess even I need forgiving sometimes. Later, as the afternoon faded into gold, Morty walked out into the garden with the hearts in his hands. The forgotten versions still glowed faintly beneath the soil. He knelt and tucked one paper heart between the roots of a sleeping invention. The wind stirred again, soft as breath, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of red light pulse gently through the earth. Rick watched from the porch, silent. The paper hearts on his table rustled faintly as if responding. When the last of the sunlight sank below the horizon, Morty returned inside. Rick had fallen asleep at his workbench, an unfinished heart still clutched in his hand. The machines hummed quietly in the dark, and the air shimmered faintly. Not from science, but from something simpler. Forgiveness, maybe, or peace. Morty smiled, turned off the lamp, and whispered into the quiet. "Good night, Rick." For a brief moment, one of the paper hearts on the table fluttered upward on its own, as if the breath of 100 versions exhaled through it. Then it stilled. The house breathed again. The night was gentle, and somewhere in the dark, 1,000 tiny hearts beat softly, forgiving, remembering, alive. The air that morning smelled like rain that had already passed. Clean, tired, and full of remembering. The sky hung low over the house, heavy with color, like watercolor left too long in the brush. Somewhere in the distance, a thundercloud sighed and moved on. Morty 7 sat on the stone steps behind the garage, his sneakers buried in overgrown grass. He wasn't really waiting for anyone, but still, he looked up whenever the wind changed, as if some part of him expected the world to call his name. His jacket was older, his hair a little unkempt, his smile slower. The kind of smile that comes after you've made peace with being misunderstood. The real, or maybe not real, Morty found him there. He carried 2 mugs of cocoa instead of coffee, the way you might carry an offering.
"Thought you might want one," he said quietly. Morty 7 nodded, taking the mug.
Steam rose between them like a small, glowing veil. "Thanks," he said, then smiled faintly. "We still take it with too much sugar, huh?" Morty blinked.
"You mean..." "I mean we," said Morty 7. "Not you or me, just us."
"Whoever that really is," they both laughed, a soft, uncertain sound that faded into the long hush of the garden. Around them, the air shimmered with small noises, the hum of sleeping inventions beneath the soil, the slow trickle of water somewhere behind the hedges, the faint rustle of paper hearts catching the breeze. It was peaceful in a strange, fragile way, like standing inside a memory that knows it's ending but still wants to stay a while. After a while, Morty asked, "Do you remember everything I remember?" Morty 7 tilted his head, thinking, "Most things."
"But they feel different."
"Like old photos that someone else took?" "Yeah," Morty said softly. "Like remembering something that never happened to you but still missing it anyway." Morty 7 nodded. "Exactly." He took another sip, then looked toward the horizon where the clouds were thinning into gold.
"You know what's weird?
"I don't think any of us were mistakes."
I think we were just practice. Practice for what?"
"For being human," he said, "or whatever passes for that." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. The kind of silence that feels like it's thinking with you. Morty watched the reflections in his mug, the soft, distorted shapes of 2 versions of the same boy, caught in the same moment. "You ever think maybe the first Morty got it wrong?" he asked. Morty 7 shrugged gently.
"Maybe, or maybe there was never a first." A bird landed nearby, shaking rainwater from its wings.
For a brief second, the droplets caught the sunlight and scattered tiny rainbows across the grass. Morty smiled. "Rick would probably say we're overcomplicating it." "Rick says that about everything he doesn't want to feel," Morty 7 murmured. They both looked toward the house where Rick's silhouette moved faintly through the window. a lonely figure surrounded by glowing monitors. "You think he knows which one of us is the original?" Morty asked. "I think he stopped caring," Morty7 said. "Or maybe he realized it doesn't matter." Morty traced the rim of his mug with his thumb.
"I used to think being the real one was the only thing that mattered."
"Like it made me special," Morty7 smiled. "Being real isn't the same as being special. Sometimes it's just being kind enough to exist without needing proof." Morty looked up, eyes softening. "That's something Rick would never say." "That's why I said it," Morty7 replied, and they both laughed again, quietly, like brothers who finally understood the same joke. The wind carried the sound of their laughter across the garden, through the rustling leaves and the low hum of forgotten machines. It was a sound that didn't need to belong to anyone in particular. It just was. Later they wandered through the garden together. The moss glowed faintly where sunlight touched it. Underneath, bits of old metal and glass shimmered like tiny fossils of invention. Morty7 stopped by a cracked mirror half buried in the ground. Their reflections stared back, similar but not quite the same. Morty bent down and brushed dirt from the edge, revealing a faint engraving along the frame, prototype of possibility. "Rick made this one when he still believed in do-overs," Morty7 said. "He thought maybe every mistake was just another start." "Guess he was right," Morty murmured. They stood side by side, watching the glass tremble slightly with their breath. The reflection blurred and doubled, then tripled, as if the world couldn't decide how many of them it wanted. Morty7 looked thoughtful. "You ever notice how the reflections look calmer than we do?" "Maybe they already forgave themselves," Morty said. That made Morty7 smile again. Slow, real, the kind of smile that heals something you didn't realize was broken. They walked until the sky turned lavender and the shadows stretched long. On the way back, Morty handed Morty7 one of Rick's paper hearts. It glowed faintly red in the dimming light. "Rick made these," Morty said. "He said they're for remembering kindness." Morty7 took it gently, holding it as if it were alive.
"Then I'll remember you," he whispered. "Me?"
"Yeah, or whichever one of you are." Morty felt his throat tighten, but in a soft way. Not from sadness, but from something deeper, something like recognition.
"Thanks," he said. When they reached the porch, Morty7 stopped. "I don't think I'll stay much longer," he said.
"Feels like my time's fading." Morty's heart sank.
"You mean?"
Morty7 smiled, shaking his head. "No endings, remember? Just softer beginnings somewhere else." The two of them stood there in silence as the first stars began to appear. Tiny, patient lights watching everything unfold. "Hey," Morty said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If there are infinite versions of us?"
"You think they all find peace?"
Morty7 looked up at the sky, where the fading daylight and the rising night met in a thin silver line. "Eventually," he said, "even the lost ones."
"Especially the lost ones." He placed the paper heart against his chest.
The wind caught it, and for a brief, shining moment, it fluttered like a real heartbeat, then dissolved into light. Morty blinked against the glow. When it faded, the steps were empty. Only the sound of wind through grass remained. He stood there for a long time, listening. Somewhere deep in the garden, one of the old machines exhaled softly and went still, as if sighing in relief. Morty turned toward the house. Through the window, he saw Rick asleep at his desk again, a faint red heart pinned to his sleeve. Morty smiled and whispered to the quiet, "Guess we're all just practice versions, huh?" The stars didn't answer, but they seemed to twinkle a little closer. Like a nod, like understanding. And in that quiet night, Morty realized that maybe being a copy wasn't a curse at all. Maybe it was the universe's way of giving you another chance to be kind, to laugh, to love, and to mean it. The air stilled. The world breathed, And somewhere, faintly, he thought he heard Morty 7's voice. Soft, content, and infinite. Whisper back, yeah, another chance. Beneath the Smith's house, below the hum of the garage, there was a sound that didn't belong to any machine. It was softer, like breath caught between dreams, a slow exhale beneath the floorboards. Morty noticed it first one evening when the air felt unusually still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Rick was bent over a half-finished project, the table scattered with glowing shards of glass and quiet equations that seemed to breathe light. Morty hesitated before asking, "Do you hear that?"
Rick didn't look up.
"Yeah," he murmured, "that's not the refrigerator." The hum deepened, not loud, but alive. It pulsed through the soles of their feet. Rick pushed aside his tools and tapped the corner of the garage floor. A faint seam revealed itself beneath layers of dust, the outline of something hidden, a door disguised as cement. Without ceremony, Rick pulled a lever hidden behind the toolbox. The floor groaned softly and began to sink, carrying them downward on a trembling platform. Morty clutched the railing, his heartbeat sinking with the rhythmic pulse echoing from below. They descended into a space that wasn't quite mechanical, not entirely natural either, a vast, dimly lit chamber stretching beyond sight. Pale blue lights glowed like sleeping stars, illuminating rows upon rows of glass pods. Each one held a silhouette, human-shaped but still, folded as if in prayer. "Are these—" Morty started, his voice thinning into the silence. "Yeah," Rick said quietly. "Copies." Morty stepped closer. The nearest pod was covered in a thin layer of condensation. He wiped it gently with his sleeve.
A face appeared behind the glass. His face, peaceful, asleep.
The reflection stared back, eyes closed, mouth resting in the faintest smile. Something inside Morty went still.
"How many are there?"
Rick's answer came slowly, like a confession he'd rehearsed too many times. "Enough to remind me I don't always get it right." He walked between the rows, his boots echoing softly on the metallic floor. Every few steps he stopped, not to examine, but to look. His hand occasionally brushed against the glass, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken. The air down there was warm, faintly humming with energy. Some of the pods emitted a soft heartbeat sound, mechanical but strangely tender, like lullabies written in circuits. Morty tried to imagine all these versions of himself dreaming the same dream. Were they aware of each other? Did they know who was real? Did it even matter anymore? One pod caught his eye, smaller, dimmer than the rest.
Inside, the clone had his hand pressed against the glass, palm open, as if reaching for something just out of reach.
Morty placed his own hand on the other side. The glass was cool, almost trembling. Rick noticed and paused nearby.
"Don't wake him." "I'm not," Morty whispered.
"He looks tired." Rick sighed, his voice low and measured. They all were. "That's why I let them sleep." Morty turned to him, searching for words. "Did you—"
"Make all of these?"
Rick gave a small nod. "Once upon a time I thought I could fix loneliness by duplicating it." His eyes softened. "Turns out it doesn't scale." They stood in silence. The hum deepened again, a slow rhythm that filled the space like a heartbeat beneath the world. Morty wandered further, counting the pods, though he lost track quickly. Some were faintly lit, others completely dark, as though time had erased their stories. Each one was a version of a moment, a decision made differently, a life that almost was. He thought of Morty 7, his quiet twin in the garden. Maybe one of these pods once held him too, before he found his own patch of moonlit moss to rest in. Maybe they all deserved that, a garden, a name, and forgiveness. Rick had stopped beside a console at the far end of the room. The screen glowed with faint amber light. "I used to catalogue them," he said, gesturing toward the display.
Notes, traits, memory strands.
But after a while, it started to feel like writing obituaries for ghosts that never lived. Morty joined him. The screen listed dozens of variations, Morty 1 through Morty, each tagged with a small description. Braver, kinder, forgot how to laugh, stayed too long. Morty stared at them, his throat tightening. They're all...
Me? Rick nodded.
Versions of you?
Versions of me.
Versions of everything that could have gone wrong or right. The console flickered softly, its light reflecting in Rick's eyes. For a moment, he didn't look like a scientist or a genius. He looked like a man watching memories he didn't have the strength to keep. Why didn't you destroy them? Morty asked gently. Rick didn't answer immediately. His voice came out quiet, stripped of its usual sharpness. Because I thought maybe someday one of them would wake up better than I did. The hum seemed to slow,
as though the machines themselves were listening. Morty placed a hand on the console,
fingers brushing against the glowing controls. They don't need to wake up to be better, he said softly. They already look at peace. Rick's lips twitched into a small, tired smile. Yeah, maybe that's enough. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, surrounded by silent reflections of themselves, the air heavy with the sound of mechanical breathing. It didn't feel eerie. It felt sacred, like walking through the memory of a prayer. Eventually, Rick exhaled and reached for the switch. We should let them rest. The lights dimmed slowly, one by one. Each pod's glow faded like a sigh until the chamber was left in near darkness, the hum thinning to a whisper. Morty's voice broke the stillness, soft as moonlight. They're not gone, right? Rick looked up toward the faint circle of the ceiling far above. No, he murmured. Nothing ever really is.
They're just dreaming now.
That's what rest is. The universe remembering itself. As they rose back toward the surface, the platform trembling gently beneath their feet, Morty looked down through the fading light. The rows of sleeping selves disappeared into shadow, like stars sinking below the horizon. When the floor sealed shut again, the sound beneath was gone, replaced by the quiet, ordinary hum of the garage. Rick picked up a small wrench, pretending to work. Morty stood there a little longer, listening for echoes that would never come. He finally whispered, almost to himself, maybe we're all just one of them. Still dreaming. Rick didn't look up, but his voice softened. Then let's dream something good, huh? The air felt lighter, the silence peaceful. The machines above began their gentle whirring again, not as reminders of what was made, but as lullabies for what was forgiven. And in that quiet, beneath the hum of invention and memory, the world seemed to breathe again. Summer wandered through the house that evening, with a softness she rarely allowed herself. The air smelled faintly of dust and pine, of late sunlight slipping through curtains, and of old paper curling on shelves. She felt as if she were moving through a memory that belonged to someone else but somehow carried her name. She had discovered a narrow staircase behind the laundry room, hidden beneath a panel Rick probably never meant to show anyone. The steps creaked faintly, each one releasing the soft echo of forgotten footsteps. She paused halfway, pressing her palm to the wall as though it might tell her a story, then continued upward, curiosity keeping her careful. Quiet pace. At the top, she found a small door, old and varnished to a faint golden glow. A brass knob reflected the lamplight, worn smooth by years of touch. Summer twisted it gently. The door opened into a room she hadn't known existed. A library, but not like any she had ever seen. Every wall was lined with shelves, and on those shelves lay countless notebooks, ledgers, and scrolls. Each was labeled in meticulous handwriting, tiny letters that danced like careful whispers across the spines. Summer knelt, running her fingers along a row, feeling the grooves of the ink, the faint indentations of memory pressed into paper. Rick's handwriting, that much was certain. She picked up a notebook, its cover plain and brown, and opened it.
Inside were names, thousands of them.
Every clone Rick had ever made, every accidental duplicate, every version of a Morty she had ever glimpsed, even in passing. Some names were familiar: Morty 1, Morty 3, Morty 7. Others were strange, fading almost into scribbles like he had lost patience halfway through. Summer sat cross-legged on the floor, reading aloud in a voice quieter than a sigh. One by one, the names floated into the air as if they had always wanted to be spoken. Morty 12, Morty 14,
Morty 17.
The words felt like gentle exhalations. Each name carried a life, a breath, a moment that had existed somewhere, sometime. Summer whispered them with care, letting them roll off her tongue like lullabies. She didn't understand why it comforted her so, or why the very act of reading them aloud felt like tucking them into bed. The candle in the corner flickered softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows themselves seemed to bow toward the names, nodding in acknowledgement of their existence. Summer's voice grew slower, more deliberate, as though the air itself was guiding her cadence. From the doorway, she could see Rick standing in silence, watching, pretending not to listen. His arms were crossed, but his eyes softened, tracing the motion of her lips as she read. Summer thought he would scowl, roll his eyes, or interrupt, but he didn't. He simply allowed her to continue, giving the names the respect they deserved. Morty 23.
Morty 31.
Morty 47. Summer whispered, pausing occasionally to smile faintly, to allow a name to settle into the room as if it were being held in the softest embrace. The names were not just words to her. They were echoes of lives that had been, fragments of selves that had never fully met the light, pieces of Morty that had wandered, forgotten or misplaced through the fabric of infinite possibilities. Reading them aloud, she realized, was not just acknowledgement. It was compassion, a gentle acceptance of existence in its most delicate form. When she finished, Summer closed the notebook carefully and placed it back on the shelf. Her hands lingered on the cover, and she felt the faint warmth of remembrance, like sun on skin long after the sun had set. Rick stepped forward quietly, setting a hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak, but his gesture said more than words ever could. Summer understood. He had trusted her to honor this room, to care for the unspoken stories it held. She turned, looking around the shelves one last time. Each book was a heartbeat, each name a life that had mattered. She imagined them all resting, knowing that they had been remembered. The room seemed to hum softly in acknowledgement, a quiet vibration that reverberated in the air, in the walls and in the spaces between them. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of evening blossoms. Summer closed the door gently behind her, the room slipping back into shadow and silence. She carried the names with her, not in memory alone, but in understanding that even the smallest, quietest lives could leave a lasting trace, a delicate echo in the hearts of those who chose to see. Back in the hallway, she found Morty waiting. He didn't speak. He simply smiled faintly, a quiet recognition passing between them. Summer pressed a finger to her lips, an acknowledgement of the secret intimacy they shared, that the unseen and the forgotten could still be honored. And that kindness was its own quiet legacy. As they returned to the living room, the house seemed to settle around them, sighing softly with the weight of its own memories. Outside, the first stars began to appear, trembling faintly in the cool night sky. Summer paused by the window, letting their light spill across the floor, over the walls, and into the corners where shadows had lingered. The candle flickered once more, then steadied. Summer exhaled slowly, a feeling of completion settling over her. The names had been spoken, the echoes acknowledged, and the quiet act of remembering had restored a little more peace to the world. Rick remained behind her, quiet but present, and Summer realized that some acts of care required no applause, no acknowledgement, only the gentle consistency of attention and love. And in the soft hush of the night, with the candlelight flickering and stars watching from above, she understood. Every name, every clone, every forgotten self had a place, a story, and a moment of grace. The room of names would wait for another evening.
Another voice, another whisper, and until then,
it rested in the quiet warmth of being seen. That night, the house was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The low hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of settling boards, even the soft hiss of wind through the curtains seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Rick lay in his usual chair, the dim light of the garage spilling faintly into the living room. Sleep arrived slowly, as if it too were reluctant to enter a mind that had wandered across countless realities. And then, without warning, he was elsewhere. He found himself in a place that felt older than memory, yet younger than the universe itself. The sky was a soft gradient of blues and violets, like watercolored thoughts blending seamlessly into one another. Stars dotted the expanse, faint and flickering, but here they seemed tangible, like droplets of liquid light suspended just above the ground. The air smelled of ozone and rain-soaked moss, familiar yet unfamiliar, as though he had inhaled it 1,000 times in forgotten dreams. Standing before him was a figure he recognized instantly. The original Rick. Not the chaotic, sarcastic, frayed version of himself that moved through his daily life, but the first, the one who had never felt the need to fix or control or prove anything. His hair was untamed but lighter, eyes clear, unburdened, and a faint smile rested upon his lips. "You've spent so long," the original. Rick said, voice soft, almost a whisper that rippled across the dreamscape.
"Trying to prove you're real? That you forgot how to rest," Rick blinked, swallowing a lump in his throat he didn't even know he carried.
He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, he felt the weight of countless nights spent awake, tinkering, worrying, building, of every clone, every universe, every self that had ever crossed his path, pressing lightly against his chest. "You think perfection is measured by control," the original Rick continued, "by fixing everything, by cataloging every mistake,
Every shadow, every echo of yourself.
but reality is softer than that. Kindness is softer than that, and forgiveness."
Even softer still, Rick's breath caught.
He wanted to argue, to dismiss, to deflect with humor, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, he saw visions behind his eyelids, flashes of machines humming lullabies, rows of dormant clones breathing in mechanical slumber. Morty's soft face illuminated by candlelight as he read the list of names aloud. He saw Summer tracing her fingers over the spines of those notebooks, carrying the weight of forgotten selves with gentle reverence. "Every version of you," the original Rick said, stepping closer. "Every echo, every misstep, every duplicate. They were never mistakes. They were attempts. They were love. They were learning. And now it's time to let them rest. And so should you." Rick felt something shift, a subtle loosening in his chest where tension had settled for years. Tears, quiet and unannounced, pricked the corners of his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he needed this dream, this permission to pause, to breathe, to release. He glanced down and saw a small version of himself, curled into a ball atop a patch of moss, looking up with eyes wide and trusting. The little Rick smiled faintly, reaching out as though to ask, "Is it enough?"
"Am I enough?"
"You always were," the original Rick replied, voice warm and unwavering. "Even when you forgot." The dream expanded, stretching into vast corridors of soft light and gentle shadows. Rick walked along them, each step echoing faintly, carrying him through memories he had tried to bury and moments he had cherished too deeply. He saw himself laughing with Morty 7 under the moon, tinkering beside Summer as she whispered names aloud, and finally, standing in the quiet factory beneath the house as hundreds of sleeping selves rested in tranquil stasis. Time moved differently here, slow, deliberate, unhurried. He understood, in a way that logic never permitted, that there was no rush, no deadline, no urgency. Every version, every echo, every attempt at existence was part of a whole, a rhythm, a melody, a heartbeat that was bigger than any one self. The original? Rick raised a hand, palm open. You can carry it lightly now.
All of it. Let the weight go.
Even if it feels impossible in the waking world, know that peace is yours to claim. Rick felt the warmth of the gesture seep into him, spreading through his chest, limbs and head, washing the restless tension away like sunlight dissolving morning mist. He closed his eyes, allowing the dream to cradle him, to soothe him, to remind him that rest was not failure but a quiet, necessary act of love for himself, for Morty, for every fragile, impermanent version of everything he had ever touched. The dream shifted one last time. The sky melted into soft starlight, pooling around his feet like liquid silver. He felt a hand brush against his own, small, warm, unassuming, and he realized it was Morty 7's. His quiet twin looked up at him with eyes filled not with fear or confusion, but with quiet acceptance, and whispered, "We're learning together." Rick felt the truth of it deep in his chest. The act of trying, of caring, of loving through infinite possibilities, that was enough. It had always been enough. When he awoke, it was morning, and the garage was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of sunlight across the floor. A small tear streaked his cheek, unbidden and unashamed. Morty stirred beside him, eyes blinking open, curious and half dreaming. Rick simply smiled, a little fragile, a little unsteady, but real. He didn't have to say anything. The peace of the dream lingered like a soft glow in the room, and for the first time in a long time, Rick allowed himself to rest. Fully, quietly, without apology. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faint scent of moss and earth. The hum of the house, the soft morning light, the quiet presence of those he loved. All of it became a lullaby. A reminder that even in chaos there was calm, and that every self, every version, every echo was deserving of peace. And in that serene, unhurried morning, Rick felt it, the original self, the fractured selves, the sleeping selves beneath the house, and the living, breathing Morty beside him. All were enough. The world exhaled softly, carrying the quiet of infinite understanding. The morning arrived like a sigh stretched across the horizon. The air shimmered faintly, as if the world itself had paused, uncertain which reality it belonged to. Morty awoke to a quiet light spilling through the blinds, soft and diffused, painting the walls in pale golds and tender lilacs. He blinked slowly, sensing something had shifted, though he could not yet name it. Outside, the wind carried a faint hum, a vibration that felt almost like the heartbeat of the universe. When he stepped into the backyard, the sky astonished him. It was not broken exactly, but split, a gentle fracture across the heavens, revealing layers of other skies beneath. Soft glimmers of moonlight intertwined with sunlight, stars twinkled amidst faint clouds, and faint shadows of other Ricks and Mortys flickered in parallel movement, each echoing their quiet morning routines. Some brushed teeth, some stirred coffee, some simply stood still, watching their reflections in fractured pools of light. Morty 7 appeared beside him, calm and unhurried, as though he had anticipated this moment. "We've all been here before," he said softly, eyes tracing the endless sky. "Just not together." Morty nodded, trying to absorb the sight. Thousands of versions of themselves, infinite in possibility, overlapped the world without chaos. There was no panic, no frantic energies, but only stillness. A quiet understanding settled across each face, mirrored in every duplicated figure, as though the mere act of existing together in one space offered them permission to breathe more freely. He noticed a Rick standing at a distance,
hands tucked into lab coat pockets, staring at an invisible horizon.
That Rick seemed older, gentler somehow, the weight of countless universes pressing lightly against him, yet his posture carried a quiet grace. Morty felt a pang of recognition, as if he were seeing the very essence of the person he had long struggled to understand. Flawed, tired, endlessly trying, yet capable of gentle wisdom. The split in the sky pulsed softly, like a slow, rhythmic breathing. With every pulse, more versions of their world layered themselves, sliding effortlessly into place, merging yet remaining distinct. Morty 7 reached out, taking Morty's hand, small and warm. "We're all the same dream," he whispered, just told differently. Morty's gaze drifted upward. Each fractured layer of the sky reflected light differently. Some silver, some golden, some tinted with the faintest hint of lavender. It was mesmerizing, hypnotic, and in its quiet wonder, Morty felt an unusual peace settle over him. Each echo, each version was alive, breathing, existing. None felt less real, none more essential. He wandered through the yard, hand in hand with Morty 7, observing Ricks and Mortys performing small, mundane acts, adjusting a tie, yawning, setting a cup down on a table, tying shoelaces. These moments, seemingly insignificant, felt monumental now, fragments of existence made whole simply through attention and recognition. The air carried a soft chorus of whispered greetings, echoes of conversation, laughter that had no urgency, just gentle acknowledgement. A distant Rick approached, joined by a Morty, unfamiliar, yet comforting. They moved together in unhurried symmetry, and Morty realized that every version of himself carried a trace of him. Hopes, fears, curiosities, and small joys folded into infinite possibilities. And yet, none of it felt heavy. All of it felt luminous. The garden behind the house began to shimmer, revealing traces of past inventions and forgotten experiments. Each mechanical contraption pulsed faintly with light, their once purposeful hum now a gentle lullaby. The fractured sky above mirrored their glow, sending faint ripples across the layered heavens. Morty understood that even the tools, the creations, and the echoes of mistakes were part of this quiet symphony of existence. He breathed slowly, feeling the universe pulse through him. Each breath connected him to every Morty, every Rick, every iteration of life and choice. He no longer felt isolated or uncertain. Instead, he felt embraced, part of an intricate, infinite tapestry where each thread mattered. Even if momentarily Ennui and Morty 7 squeezed his hand, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the weight of understanding that identity was not singular, that reality was not fixed, and that even the softest, quietest versions of oneself deserved acknowledgement. The split sky above was not a fracture. It was an invitation, a gentle reminder that multiplicity could coexist with harmony. Time flowed differently here, slow and deliberate. Morty watched as shadows lengthened, as light softened, as infinite selves drifted gracefully in their overlapping realities. Every movement, every quiet gesture resonated with calm. There was no urgency, no need to act, only the serenity of witnessing, of being, of existing fully in the delicate pulse of the universe. As the day wore on, the fractured sky, gradually merged into a single soft twilight. Colors bled gently into one another: lilac, gold, silver, and the faintest blush of dawn. The layers above condensed into a harmonious whole, reflecting the countless echoes that had wandered, rested, and coexisted. Morty 7 released his hand, and Morty felt a tender sense of completion, as if every version of himself had finally understood that they were not competing, not fractured, just different facets of one quiet, shared existence. Morty turned toward the house, where Rick had paused in the doorway, observing the sky with a faint, contemplative smile. They didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. The split had shown them all what mattered: presence, understanding, and gentle acknowledgement of every iteration of life. The wind carried faint laughter, soft and lingering, and the first stars appeared, trembling gently as if bowing to infinite selves resting in the calm. Morty inhaled deeply, letting the warmth of the moment fill him, understanding in a way he never had that identity, multiplicity, and acceptance were inseparable, and as night fully descended, the sky no longer split, but glowed softly with memory.
Light and quiet reflection.
Morty knew finally that each echo of himself had a place, each iteration a heartbeat in the vast expanse, and every breath a gentle affirmation of being. The world exhaled with him.
A single serene pulse of infinity, and he felt the quiet truth. All of them. Every Rick.
Every Morty were part of the same dream, told differently, yet harmoniously. Morning arrived slowly, not with urgency, but as if the world itself was taking a soft, deliberate breath. Light spilled through the windows, warm and gentle, stretching across the floor in elongated golden ribbons. Morty sat cross-legged on the rug, watching his own shadow stretch and bend, then disappear, replaced by another, familiar yet subtly different. For a moment, he could not tell which version of himself he was seeing. Each breath seemed to carry a trace of someone else, faint echoes of choices he could not remember making. It was not frightening. Strange, yes. Disorienting, yes. But beneath it all was a quiet relief. A realization had settled in his chest, soft as dawn light. Identity is not about being first, or perfect, or even whole.
It is about presence, about kindness, and about understanding.
Even when the edges of self blur into someone else. Rick moved through the garage with his usual measured grace, tinkering quietly at a workbench filled with half-finished gadgets, notes scattered like leaves caught in a gentle wind. He glanced at Morty from the corner of his eye, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing his lips. Words were unnecessary. The warmth in his gaze carried all the reassurance Morty needed. "You're more real," Rick whispered softly, though not aloud, letting the quiet vibrations of his voice linger in the room, than most people who ever lived. Morty let the words settle, though they did not belong entirely to him. Each echo of his self, each clone, each iteration that had once crowded the hidden factory beneath the garage, all seemed to whisper the same truth. Being is less about origin and more about how gently you move through the lives around you. He wandered toward the hidden doors that led to the factory, now shuttered and silent. The machinery was still, breathing faintly as if resting after a long, careful labor. Rows upon rows of sleeping duplicates stretched before him, faces peaceful, hands folded, bodies at ease. There was no fear in their stillness, only the quiet dignity of existence acknowledged and honored. Morty knelt beside them, tracing a finger lightly over a paper heart pinned to one chest. The small heart quivered softly, fluttering like a tiny flame against the cool air. And in that movement, Morty felt something tender, forgiveness, acceptance, a gentle reassurance that even fleeting selves were meaningful. Time, Two seemed to behave differently in this space. The air was thick with both centuries and moments, a paradoxical lull that invited reflection. Morty 7 appeared beside him once more, settling quietly on the floor, legs crossed, hands resting in his lap. "It's strange," Morty 7 murmured. "I can't tell which one of us I am anymore."
But I think that's okay. Morty nodded, understanding instantly.
Perhaps the unraveling of self was not loss, but liberation. Perhaps letting go of the need to be singular, to claim originality, was the truest form of freedom. Each clone, each echo, each practice version of who they were had lived and breathed and mattered.
None were more or less, none were failures, only participants in the quiet symphony of life, learning to rest, to forgive, and to love. Rick's hands paused on the workbench, tools resting in quiet symmetry.
He observed Morty with something like awe, though his expression remained calm. In this slow unraveling, he saw not confusion but clarity. Morty was learning what Rick had only just remembered, that being real was less about permanence and more about presence, less about certainty and more about the willingness to care, to honor each moment, each self, each echo. Morty wandered further into the garage, brushing fingertips across dormant machines. The hum of their circuits faint, almost melodic. A gentle warmth spread from his chest outward, as if every act of remembrance, every whispered name, every paper heart pinned in quiet care, had accumulated into a soft light inside him. The feeling was infinite and unhurried, a soft gravity holding him in place, tethered to kindness, tethered to memory, tethered to existence itself. Outside, the sky shifted slowly, a living canvas of muted blues and silvers. Clouds drifted like whispers, brushing against one another with delicate, rhythmic grace. The house, the garden, the hidden factory beneath, all pulsed faintly, synchronized with the breathing of countless selves. Morty inhaled, felt the vibration, and allowed himself to dissolve, just slightly, into the flow of being. It was in this quiet surrender that Morty understood a deeper truth. The self was not a fixed entity. It was fluid, luminous, interwoven with the lives and echoes of others. To let go of strict identity was not loss, but a gentle, liberating embrace of the shared experience of life. The unraveling was a song, and he was learning to listen fully and attentively to its tender notes. Rick placed a hand briefly on Morty's shoulder, an unspoken acknowledgement of understanding and shared wisdom. No words were needed. The quiet hum of the garage, the fluttering paper hearts, the gentle breath of the dormant clones, and the slow unraveling of time itself spoke more eloquently than any sentence could. And in the stillness, with the world breathing around him and the multiplicity of selves shimmering faintly in the soft light, Morty felt it completely. The quiet peace of being, the gentle beauty of impermanence, and the profound, tender truth that identity, like love, could be limitless, patient, and forgiving. Every edge of his being softened, every line between past, present, and future blurred. And Morty rested in the knowledge that he was enough.
Always, and not singularly, not perfectly, but wholly.
And with the quiet grace of infinite care. The machines hummed a faint, final lullaby, the paper hearts fluttered once more, and the garage, the home of echoes and soft memories, held a quiet, eternal breath. The garage was quieter than it had ever been. The faint hum of machinery, which once held the rhythm of countless duplications, now softened into a tender lullaby. Light from the overhead fixtures fell in gentle pools across the floor, painting the dormant machines with a warm glow, like moonlight touching a still pond. Morty walked slowly, his footsteps nearly inaudible against the smooth concrete, each one a careful acknowledgement of the life that had once stirred here. Rows upon rows of clones lay frozen in their stasis pods, their forms relaxed, eyes closed, expressions softened by the weight of rest.
No fear remained, no urgency.
Each being was suspended in a delicate peace, a quiet testament to existence without the burden of competition, without the pressing need to prove or survive. Morty's hand brushed lightly over one pod, and the paper heart Rick had placed earlier fluttered faintly,
lifting as if it carried its own gentle breath. Rick moved through the room beside him,
hands tucked behind his back, eyes observing each pod with a reverence he rarely allowed himself to show. There was no lecture, no scientific note, no experiment to conduct, only attention. And in that attention, Morty sensed care, something older and more profound than knowledge, quiet forgiveness. The kind of forgiveness that doesn't need words, that does not demand recognition. That simply exists. Morty paused at a row of pods near the back, where the last of the duplicates rested. A small pulse of light moved through the room, as if the machines themselves were exhaling, releasing the tension of centuries into the calm. He knelt before the final pod, carefully pressing a paper heart against it. It quivered once, then settled, radiating warmth like a heartbeat. Morty realized in that moment that the clones had never been lifeless. They had merely been waiting, suspended between the world and the possibility of peace. Rick stood quietly behind him, the familiar lines of his face softened in the gentle glow. "They don't need to run anymore," he said, not loudly, but with a voice that carried across the hum of the room.
"All the chasing, all the proving, it's over." He let the words drift, unpinned from urgency or expectation, letting them linger in the soft air.
Morty felt them settle into him, as if the garage itself had absorbed the weight of countless versions of their lives, and now offered it back as something light and freeing. Each pod seemed to respond, however subtly, to the stillness around it. The hum that had been constant now flickered and dimmed, like a candle in a gentle breeze. Morty could almost feel the air thickening with exhalations, tiny breaths of beings finally allowed to rest. The room smelled faintly of metal and warmth, of things made with care, and of time finally slowing to a pace where noticing and being were enough. He rose slowly, taking in the symmetry of the rows, endless possibilities,
infinite echoes, each one paused, each one honored.
It was strange to think how much he had worried about which version of himself was real, how much effort had gone into tracing every path and every choice. Now, in the quiet of the sleeping machines, he understood that reality was not about uniqueness, nor about being first or perfect. It was about being present. It was about allowing peace to exist. Morty 7 appeared again, leaning slightly against the doorway. He watched with soft eyes, his posture relaxed, unhurried. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Morty asked, his voice quiet, more a thought than a question. "They won't have to," Morty 7 replied. "Because this
is enough.
Being still, being here, that's remembering in itself." Rick moved closer, laying a hand gently on Morty's shoulder. No lecture, no explanation, simply presence. Morty felt a warmth flow from that touch, carrying the quiet affirmation of understanding, a validation of existence that no words could ever capture. Together they watched the hum fade, each machine slowly dimming into soft darkness, until the garage was no longer alive with motion, but alive with memory and peace. Morty wandered one last time between the pods, noticing the faintest glimmer of reflection in the metal and glass. He imagined the lives that had been, the possibilities that had shimmered briefly into being. And he realized that each one, no matter how brief, no matter how forgotten, had contributed to the gentle harmony that now filled the space. The clones were not lost. They were resting. They were acknowledged. They were part of the quiet that now enveloped him. Rick finally moved to the exit, pausing to glance back. "It's done," he said softly, letting the words hang in the calm. Morty followed, stepping out into the twilight, where shadows had softened and the sky carried the faint shimmer of stars yet to awaken. For a moment they both stood silently, absorbing the serenity of completion, of lives held gently in the embrace of time. Morty exhaled, and the weight of multiplicity and expectation lifted. He understood now that identity was a gentle unfolding, that every echo, every self, every version of him and Rick had mattered simply by existing. And in that knowledge, there was peace, the kind of peace that had no urgency, no deadlines, no need for perfection. Only the soft, infinite permission to rest. The garage remained behind them, silent and luminous in memory. The paper hearts had settled, the hum had faded, and the machines, finally, had learned to sleep. And Morty, for the first time in countless repetitions and mirrored mornings, felt fully present, fully real, fully at peace. The night stretched across the sky like a soft, infinite blanket. Morty lay on the grass just beyond the house, watching stars drift slowly above him, each one trembling faintly, as if aware of his gaze. The world around him had quieted. The echoes of machines, clones, and repeated mornings were gone, leaving only a stillness so deep it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. The air smelled of earth, faint dew, and the lingering warmth of a day that had refused to hurry. He thought of the duplicates that had come and gone. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, each one an echo of choices, moments, and whispered possibilities. Some had lingered longer, some barely a blink, yet everyone had left a trace, however subtle, in the gentle rhythm of the house, the garage, and the garden. And now only he remained, or perhaps not. Perhaps the uncertainty itself was part of the lesson, that the self is fluid and yet whole, even when impossible to define. Rick approached quietly, sitting a short distance away on the edge of the porch. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The night was full of unspoken understandings, of moments suspended in calm reflection. Morty turned his gaze toward him, and Rick's eyes held a softness that had been rare in the endless whirl of experiments, chaos, and fractured realities. There was no lecture, no correction, only the acknowledgement of presence. Morty 7 had said that multiplicity mattered, but now, with only this singular space, Morty understood something deeper. The importance was never in being first, or original, or fully distinct. It was in the quiet attention to existence itself. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of recognition, they were all acts of presence, threads weaving the fragile,
luminous tapestry of life. Rick finally broke the silence, murmuring,
barely more than a vibration in the air. Maybe none of us are copies. Maybe we're just echoes learning to love. Morty felt the words settle in his chest, soft and warm, a gentle pulse that matched the rhythm of the stars above. There was no need for certainty. There was no need for proof. Love, he realized, was the only true measure, and even echoes could carry it fully. He lay back on the cool grass, tracing constellations with his eyes, watching patterns of light that seemed to shift and sway, as if responding to thoughts too quiet to form words. The last duplicate, whether he was truly the original or not, felt whole in a way that nothing had ever made him feel before. The multiplicity of selves was not lost. It was integrated, acknowledged, and released into a gentle harmony that encompassed everything and everyone, even those who no longer existed in physical form. Rick reached over, nudging Morty's shoulder lightly, a small, grounding gesture. Morty leaned into it, feeling the steady weight of the presence beside him. In that simple touch, he sensed the continuity of care, the unspoken promise that even in uncertainty, even when everything else faded, They were not alone. The universe, for all its multiplicity, all its shifting timelines and mirrored selves, had finally offered a pause, a space to breathe, to rest, to simply be. Around them, the night deepened. Shadows softened into a velvet calm, and the faintest breeze carried the scent of the earth, the lingering warmth of memories, and the quiet songs of distant stars. Morty's mind slowed, thoughts drifting into gentle spirals, echoing the pattern of the skies above. He felt a luminous calm settle over him, a sense that all the fragments of himself,
All the duplicates, all the repeated mornings,
had converged into this singular moment of serene awareness. He imagined the paper hearts Rick had used, each one fluttering faintly in the unseen corners of the garage, a testament to care, attention, and forgiveness. He understood now that the heart, in its quiet simplicity, held more truth than any name, any label, any attempt at defining reality. Every being, every version, every echo of life had mattered, and in their disappearance, they left only tenderness, continuity, and a soft, persistent glow of love. Morty closed his eyes, feeling the night fold around him like a soft, protective cloak. The stars above, the grass beneath, the faint hum of the earth itself, all spoke of permanence, not in form, but in presence. Every heartbeat was an affirmation, every breath a gentle witness to existence. And in that awareness, he finally allowed himself to rest completely without question, without fear. Rick's hand remained nearby, steady and warm, an unspoken reminder that some connections transcend time, duplication, and certainty. Morty exhaled slowly, letting go of all the identities, all the labels, all the echoes. There was only now, only calm, only the serene understanding that being real was less about origin and more about the quiet embrace of the moment, of oneself and of those who had once shared the journey. The night deepened further, gentle and infinite. Stars shimmered faintly, shadows swayed, and the universe seemed to inhale along with him, a single, rhythmic pulse of quiet presence. Morty understood fully, finally, that all the multiplicity, all the clones, all the echoes of life, had led here to stillness, to acceptance, to a luminous,
unhurried peace. And in that soft,
expansive calm, the last duplicate rested, knowing that every moment, every echo, every whisper of existence had been enough. The evening had settled into a deep,
violet calm, brushing the sky with the quiet shimmer of twilight.
Morty and Rick sat together on the porch, the air around them soft with the scent of distant blooms and the faint warmth of the fading day. Shadows stretched lazily across the ground, folding into themselves, and the gentle hum of the universe felt as though it had slowed just to accommodate this moment of stillness. In his hands, Rick held the fragile list of names, a tiny, meticulous record of every duplicate,
every echo, every reflection of themselves.
He had carried it for years, tucked between notebooks, hidden beneath stacks of scribbled calculations, a silent reminder of the multiplicity that had once defined their lives. Now, though, it felt weightless, like paper caught in the faintest draft. He looked at Morty, eyes softened, the habitual smirk replaced with a quiet reverence. Without a word, Rick set the list alight. The flames began small, gentle, licking the paper without urgency, consuming it with quiet grace.
Ash rose slowly, drifting like stardust into the twilight, vanishing before it could even touch the earth.
Morty watched the transformation, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the slow dance of the ashes. Each letter, each name, each memory embedded in ink dissolved into the air, leaving behind nothing but warmth, light, and the delicate echo of acknowledgement. The act itself was silent, yet it spoke volumes. Identity, he realized, was never about possession, about holding on to what was past or proving who was first. It was about acceptance of oneself, of others, of the echoes that inevitably ripple across time. Morty felt the gravity of being real, not in the certainty of his origins, but in the quiet act of witnessing, in the tender permission to exist fully without expectation, without comparison. The ashes swirled in the breeze, catching the last rays of the fading sun, shimmering briefly like fragments of gold and silver. Morty reached out instinctively, letting the particles brush against his fingers, tracing their paths as they rose and disappeared. There was a softness in the impermanence, a serenity in the acknowledgement that nothing needed to be held on to be meaningful. Every duplicate, every echo, every whispered name mattered simply because it had existed. And now, it was free to rest. Rick leaned back slightly, exhaling a slow, careful breath. He didn't speak, but Morty could feel the layers of understanding, of acceptance, of quiet surrender in that simple gesture. It was a language beyond words, one of presence and acknowledgement, of letting go and trusting the world to carry its own weight. Morty mirrored the motion, leaning slightly into the warmth of Rick's side, feeling the shared calm settle over them like a gentle tide. Around them the universe hummed softly. Stars blinked awake, one by one, their light diffused through a thin veil of clouds. The air was filled with a subtle luminescence, the sort that comes only when silence has been fully embraced, when time itself seems to pause in recognition of small, enduring truths. Morty breathed it in, letting the quiet gravity of being real anchor him. He understood now that reality was not a fixed point, nor a singular achievement. It was an acceptance of imperfection, a gentle acknowledgement of the infinite ways one could exist. The wind carried the faint echoes of laughter and footsteps, the traces of duplicates long gone. It was not haunting, but comforting, a subtle reminder that love and memory could transcend presence, that existence could be tender without needing permanence. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the paper hearts fluttering softly, each one a gentle beacon of recognition and forgiveness. They were not gone. They were integrated into the quiet rhythm of the night. Rick finally spoke, voice low and even, as though testing the air for echoes. "It's not about being first, Morty. It's about being real, in whatever way that matters to you." Morty nodded, feeling the gravity of those words settle in his chest. He didn't need to define it, to pin it down, or to trace the lines of identity any longer. Being real was present, was kind, was tender. Being real was enough. The ashes continued to drift upward, dissolving into the violet sky. Morty's hand remained close to Rick's, and in that simple connection, the universe itself seemed to sigh, a subtle vibration of calm and understanding. The day had ended, but not abruptly. It had ebbed into the night, leaving a gentle, persistent warmth in its wake. In the quiet that followed, the two of them watched the stars, breathing slowly, letting the infinite possibilities of their lives fold softly into memory. There was no urgency, no need for explanation, only the profound serenity of existence fully acknowledged. Each heartbeat, each breath, each subtle glance carried the weightless truth that being real was not about certainty or control. It was about presence, love, and the quiet acceptance of everything, even multiplicity, and in that infinite calm, Morty finally felt the release he had been searching for. The gravity of being real was not a burden, but a gentle, luminous freedom that embraced everything he had been, and everything he could still become. The first light of morning spilled softly across the floor, threading through the curtains in quiet ribbons of gold and amber. Dust motes danced lazily in the beams, floating as if in a slow, deliberate ballet, untouched by the rush of hours. Morty stirred under the warmth of blankets, feeling the weight of night dissolve into the gentle insistence of day. He could sense that something had shifted, not in grand gestures or dramatic events, but in the soft rhythm of reality itself. The house felt lighter, as though it had been unburdened along with the echoes and duplicates that had once filled its rooms. The familiar sounds, the faint creak of the floorboards, the rustle of paper, the distant hum of a cooling engine carried a new resonance, a calm continuity that was not dependent on repetition or perfection. Morty rose slowly, stretching against the warmth, letting the softness of the morning embrace him fully. Rick was already awake, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He didn't speak. There was no lesson to deliver, no urgent plan to unravel. He simply existed in the space with Morty, a shared presence that carried centuries of experience and a lifetime of tender understanding. Morty glanced at him, noticing the faint lines softened by sleep, the subtle ease in posture, the serenity of a mind that had released its hold on multiplicity. Outside, the garden was bright in the morning sun. Moss and leaves shimmered with dew, and the remnants of overgrown inventions glinted faintly, like memories held gently against the earth. The duplicates and echoes had vanished, leaving only the tangible traces of existence, traces that were real in their quiet way. Morty walked slowly among them, fingers brushing the edges of rusted metal, feeling the hum of past lives beneath his touch. Each artifact, each object, carried the resonance of care and remembrance, a testament to moments lived fully, no matter how brief. He found Rick stepping outside to join him. The air smelled fresh, mingled with warmth, earth, and a faint sweetness carried on the breeze. The two of them walked together through the garden, not speaking, letting the quiet speak for them. In the absence of mirrors, of duplicates, of repeating mornings, they found a new clarity. Reality was not about comparison or verification or the endless tally of selves. It was about presence, continuity, and the soft acknowledgement of being alive. Morty laughed softly, a sound that rose like a bubble through the calm morning air. "Feels like being real," he said, letting the words drift without expectation, allowing them to settle naturally into the warmth surrounding them. Rick glanced at him, a faint smile tracing his features, the kind that comes not from triumph or understanding, but from simple recognition. "You always were," Rick replied quietly, letting the statement exist in its gentle weightlessness. No explanation, no lesson, only acknowledgement, only the subtle affirmation of truth. Morty felt a soft wave of relief and belonging. The lingering tension of multiplicity finally released into the quiet, and the simplicity of being fully present settled over him like a warm cloak. The sun continued to rise, painting the sky in pale golds and soft pinks, its light reflecting off scattered tools and the edges of paper hearts. Shimmering faintly in rhythm with the gentle breeze, shadows softened, not erased, folding themselves into the light, a seamless integration of night and day, memory and present. Morty took a deep breath, feeling the calmness settle into every part of him, mind, body, and spirit. Rick and Morty moved slowly back toward the house, their footsteps unhurried, carrying no urgency or agenda. Each step was a quiet celebration of being, of presence, of the luminous simplicity of continuity. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, of toasted bread, and the lingering traces of a night unburdened by multiplicity. The world was no longer layered with echoes. It was singular, real, and luminous in its simplicity. Morty paused at the doorway, looking back at the garden one last time. Light shimmered over every surface, catching the edges of the past without demanding remembrance, acknowledging the traces of lives that had been, and now, were gently released. He understood fully that identity was not a question of mirrors, of duplicates, or of original versions. Identity was the experience of being here, fully, tenderly, and with acknowledgement of the quiet love woven through existence. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder again, a soft grounding, a shared presence that needed no articulation. Morty leaned into it, letting the serenity of morning, the warmth of sunlight, and the softness of continuity envelop him completely. The world, finally, felt unhurried. And in that luminous golden morning, Morty and Rick breathed together, fully present, fully real, and wholly at peace. Continuity, warmth, and love had replaced uncertainty, and the echoes of multiplicity had folded into quiet stillness. The moment stretched without end, serene and infinite, carrying the weightless knowledge that being real was never about verification.
Only acknowledgement and presence, somewhere.
In a quiet corner of a distant world, a single clone stirred. It was not Morty, nor was it Rick, though it carried the faint imprint of both in ways that mattered only to itself. The sky above was a deep indigo, scattered with distant stars that shimmered faintly, as if recognizing the small life beneath them. The air was calm, carrying a soft, almost musical resonance that made each breath feel significant. Like inhaling memory itself, the clone rose slowly, feeling the weight of existence settle comfortably over its shoulders. It had no list of names, no archive of echoes, no multiplicity to compare itself against. Here, the world was singular, simple, and yet it carried the residue of countless lives, a soft echo of love and attention that had been imparted long before, in worlds far away, in moments small and unassuming. The feeling was subtle but undeniable. It was known, it was recognized, it was loved. The landscape around it was gentle and dreamlike, a realm where the edges of reality blurred like watercolor on paper. Hills rolled softly into one another, their surfaces touched with glimmers of light that caught in rhythms too slow for ordinary perception. Trees swayed in a languid breeze, their leaves whispering faintly in a language older than memory. The clone paused, listening, and felt warmth radiate from the ground itself, a comforting pulse that resonated with the pulse of its own heartbeat. It wandered, unhurried, noticing how even small stones, blades of grass, and tiny streams reflected a quiet awareness, a softness that felt like kindness. With each step, the clone sensed that it mattered, not because of origin or distinction, but because presence alone had intrinsic value. The universe itself seemed to acknowledge this fact, folding around the clone in gentle reassurance. The stars above blinked with slow, deliberate pulses, a luminous echo of consciousness. The clone lifted its gaze, sensing a connection between the points of light and the awareness within itself. Somewhere deep in the network of infinite possibilities, threads of all the duplicates, all the echoes, all the versions of self converged into a quiet, radiant acknowledgement.
Existence was complete simply because it was witnessed.
A breeze carried a faint whisper, not in words, but in feeling, a trace of laughter, a subtle warmth of memory, a sense that love need not be claimed to be true. The clone felt a smile form, soft and unassuming, and in that smile it recognized the truth. It was never alone. Even without knowing the source, the continuity of affection, recognition, and presence had found it here. It was enough to exist, to breathe, to touch and feel and be. It paused beside a shallow pool of water, watching the faint reflection of stars ripple across the surface. For a moment, the clone imagined all the versions it could have been, all the echoes that had lived and faded, and understood that their essence remained, not in duplication, not in identity, but in the soft imprint left upon the universe itself. Every act of kindness, every quiet observation, every gentle thought had contributed to this resonance. It was carried forward beyond time, beyond counting, into the delicate hum of existence. The clone knelt beside the pool, touching the water lightly. The ripples spread outward, echoing into infinity, carrying the warmth of acknowledgement. It laughed softly, the sound mingling with the hush of the world around it, creating a lullaby of presence that was both tender and infinite. It had no need to know its origin, its real self, or its purpose in conventional terms. To exist fully, to feel, to breathe, and to acknowledge, that was the essence of being. As the night deepened, the stars above blinked slower, settling into a quiet pulse that mirrored the clone's own breath. The world itself seemed to exhale, a soft, harmonious sigh of timeless understanding. The clone lay back on the grass, letting the universe cradle it gently,
absorbing the subtle affirmation that everything, every echo, every reflection,
had led to this moment of serene awareness. It closed its eyes and felt the warmth of existence settle within, carrying the quiet joy of being known without needing explanation. The universe had learned its own name through recognition, presence, and the endless act of witnessing. Here, the clone rested, embraced by infinity, and understood that love, memory, and identity were not possessions to be guarded. They were luminous echoes, ever present, ever soft, and ever gentle. And in that timeless calm, the clone smiled again, knowing that the feeling of being cherished, however inexplicably, rippled outward, across stars, through worlds, and into every version of existence. It was enough. It was complete. The ship drifted through the velvet expanse of a sleeping universe, quiet and unhurried. Stars shimmered faintly, each pulse a soft echo of light that stretched across infinite distances, brushing the vessel with warmth. The cosmos seemed to breathe in slow, deliberate rhythms, carrying the subtle resonance of everything that had lived, everything that had been remembered, and everything that had quietly been released. Rick and Morty sat together, their forms softened by the gentle glow, eyes tracing the slow dance of constellations. There was no urgency, no adventure, no clamor of deadlines or crises, only the soft hum of the ship and the calm presence of each other, a quiet companionship that needed no explanation. Time felt malleable here, stretching and folding like liquid light, yet it was neither frightening nor disorienting. It was as if the universe itself had learned to pause, to listen, to exist without the pressure of being anything but present. Morty leaned back against the soft curve of the ship's hull, letting the warmth of the ambient lights mingle with the faint echo of remembered worlds. He could feel the multiplicity of selves, not as a weight to bear, but as a gentle ripple through the soft waters of his consciousness. Each version, each echo, each fragile copy had lived, had mattered, and had now folded into a quiet continuity, a tender rhythm that was both infinite and intimate. Rick's hand brushed lightly against his shoulder, a grounding touch that carried centuries of unspoken understanding. He didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. Presence alone conveyed what had taken so many iterations, so many duplications, to arrive at: acceptance, peace, and the luminous comfort of continuity. The ship glided silently past drifting nebulae, their colors muted yet vibrant in the softness of night. Lavender clouds spilling into charcoal and deep navy, glowing faintly from within like cosmic lanterns. Morty closed his eyes briefly, feeling the hum of the ship, the pulse of starlight, and the warmth of shared history in the quiet stretch of existence. He imagined the paper hearts fluttering gently in hidden corners of past worlds, the echoes of laughter and whispered names merging with the soft currents of infinity. There was no need to identify who had existed first, who had mattered most, or which version was the real one. All of it, the multiplicity, the echoes, the duplicates, had converged into something far softer, far more luminous, a universe that understood the tender weight of being. Rick exhaled a low, steady breath, eyes tracing a constellation that flickered like a half-remembered lullaby. He felt the cumulative presence of all the versions of Morty he had known, of all the selves he had created, of all the echoes of love and understanding he had given and received. There was a profound, gentle satisfaction in knowing that none of it had been wasted. Every act, every quiet acknowledgement, every small moment of kindness had rippled outward into the fabric of existence, softening the edges of reality itself. The ship passed by a planet cloaked in mist, its surface glowing faintly, as if it too was remembering something it had once known. Morty felt the echo of his own presence there, a tender brush of memory, and smiled softly. The realization came naturally without thought or analysis. Everything, every duplicate, every echo, every self, could rest. The universe was wide, deep, and infinite, and there was space enough for all of them to exist softly, peacefully, without fear or competition. Time stretched, yet it did not press. The two of them drifted in companionable silence, eyes half closed, hearts steady, breathing aligned with the slow rhythm of stars. Each pulse of light, each hum of the ship, each ripple of cosmic energy was a gentle affirmation. All was as it should be. Identity, multiplicity, and existence itself were no longer burdens, but gifts, tender, luminous, and infinite in their quiet repetition. Morty opened his eyes and watched the stars, feeling the subtle hum of the universe echo within him. Rick leaned slightly, and for a moment, they existed not as mentor and student, creator and creation, or origin and copy, but simply as two presences sharing a universe vast enough to cradle infinite echoes without strain. The realization was soft, comforting, and complete. Everything could rest, and everything would be remembered in the gentle hum of being. As the ship glided on through the sleeping cosmos, light diffused across the hull like a soft sigh. Morty closed his eyes again, letting the gentle multiplicity of dreams carry him. He felt each echo, each version of himself and Rick fold softly into the infinite calm. The stars hummed lullabies that reached across worlds, touching every fragment of existence with quiet reassurance. Every heartbeat, every pulse of light, every ripple of cosmic resonance whispered the same truth. All could rest, all could exist, and all could be known in the tender presence of love. And in that infinite, luminous calm, Rick and Morty drifted together, breathing with the soft pulse of the universe, letting multiplicity settle into serenity. And in the quiet between selves, they finally understood they were never copies at all, just endless versions of love remembering itself. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man.